I pushed the door open and said, Era, you won't believe what just happened. I stopped. My mouth stayed open as I saw her lips on his, slow and careless, right there near the counter. Era? I whispered. She pulled back, looked at me, then laughed again. Why are you staring like that? I said, What are you doing? Rohan tilted his head and said, Looks like we got caught. She shrugged. Relax. It's not that deep. I felt my chest tighten. Not that deep. You told me you loved me. She crossed her arms. And? People say things. I said, in public. With him? She smirked. Why not? It's fun. Rohan stepped closer and said, Man, you look shocked. I tried to speak, but my throat burned. You promised me, I said. You promised this place was ours. She rolled her eyes. Don't be dramatic. I said, so all those nights meant nothing? She laughed. You really thought they did? I felt everyone watching. I said, at least say sorry. She leaned toward me and said, for what? You assuming too much? I shook my head. I trusted you. She said, that's your mistake. Rohan said, guess you're not the main character here. I wanted to shout, but my voice stayed small. Was I ever enough? She said, honestly. No. I felt my stomach drop. Then why stay with me? She said, you were convenient. I said, you said I was special. She laughed louder. I say a lot of things. I looked at him and said, you knew about me. He shrugged. Didn't matter. I said, so this is a joke. She said, if it makes you feel better, sure. I remembered her whispering forever. I remembered believing her. I said, I would have done anything for you. She said, that's the problem. I felt my hands shaking. You're humiliating me. She smiled. You're doing that yourself. I said, was I ever loved? She paused, then said, no. Someone behind the counter whispered, is that her boyfriend? Another voice said, this is messy. I said, you hear them, Era. You're enjoying this. She said, maybe I am. I asked, when did this start? She said, does it matter? I said, it does to me. Rohan said, bro, timing isn't your friend. I said, I stood up for you. Remember that night? She said, which one? I said, when they called you selfish. She said, and you believed me when I cried. I said, you held my hand and said, I choose you. She tilted her head. I don't remember. I said, you said, I'd never hurt you. She smiled. People lie. I said, you said, kiss me like it's forever. Rohan laughed. Guess forever expired. I felt my eyes sting. Was he there when you said those things? She said, sometimes. I said, so I was sharing you the whole time. She said, don't make it ugly. I said, you already did. Rohan said, man, you're spiraling. I said, I gave you my secrets. She said, I got bored of them. I said, I planned my future around you. She said, that's not my responsibility. Someone laughed near the door. This is brutal. I said, you're proud of this? She said, I'm free. I said, free from me? She said, exactly. Rohan said, you should go. I said, I will. She said, good. I took a breath that hurt. I loved you. She said, you'll get over it. I said, maybe. But you'll remember this. She shrugged. Doubt it. I turned toward the door. Every step felt heavy. I felt numb. Behind me, she said, don't act like a victim. I said, I'm not acting. She laughed again, and people joined in. I didn't look back. I walked away while their laughter followed me, and something inside me finally broke. I woke up to my phone buzzing and thought, maybe it's her apologizing. It wasn't. A message popped up, did you see Era's story? I muttered, no, and tapped anyway. Someone had commented, she upgraded. Another said, bro looked so weak. I whispered, stop, but my thumb kept scrolling. Era's voice echoed from a video. Some people think loyalty makes them special. Her friends laughed. She added, it just makes them easy. I locked my phone and said, I didn't imagine this, right? At college, I heard my name before I saw faces. Is that him? Someone whispered. Another voice said, yeah, the guy who froze. I kept my head down. A boy laughed and said, man, I'd disappear if that happened to me. I wanted to say, I'm still here. Instead, I said nothing. Lena caught up to me and said, you didn't answer my calls. I said, I've been busy. She said, busy being humiliated? I snapped, don't say it like that. She said, like what? Like the truth. I said, I don't want pity. She said, I'm not giving pity. I'm giving concern. I said, I don't deserve either. She stopped walking. Why would you say that? I said, because everyone agrees with her. She said, everyone doesn't matter. I laughed. They do when they're louder than my thoughts. She said, you're letting her define you. I said, she already did. Later, I overheard someone say, he thought he was chosen. Another replied, delusional. I went to the washroom and stared at myself. I said, what did you miss? My reflection didn't answer. I remembered Era saying, you're different. I whispered, different enough to discard. That night, my phone buzzed again. Era posted, never settle for less. Someone commented, facts. I typed, then deleted, I was never less. I threw my phone on the bed and said, loyalty is a joke. At dinner, my mother said, you're quiet. I said, just tired. She asked, did something happen? I said, college stress. She touched my hand. You don't look stressed. You look broken. I pulled my hand away and said, I'm fine. She said softly, you don't have to lie to me. I said, I'm not ready. She nodded. When you are, I'm here. In my room, I replayed everything. I heard Era say, I choose you. Then I heard her laugh. I said, was I blind or stupid? My phone rang. Lena again. She said, please don't disappear. I said, I already have. She said, talk to me. I said, what if she's right? She paused. Right about what? I said, that I wasn't worth staying loyal to. She said, that's not how worth works. I said, then why does it feel true? She said, because betrayal poisons logic. I hung up before she could say more. Alone, I said, if loyalty means being laughed at, why have it? I remembered promises, jokes, future plans. I said, did I imagine all of it? The whispers followed me everywhere. Poor guy. Embarrassing. Serves him right. I started believing them. I said, maybe I was too much. Then, maybe I was nothing. I lay in the dark and said, she didn't just leave. I swallowed and finished, she rewrote me. I noticed him on the third day, standing near the far pillar, watching me like I was the only person in the room. I told myself, you're imagining things. The next day, he was there again. I muttered, what do you want? He finally spoke when I passed him. You walk like someone waiting to disappear. I stopped and said, do I know you? He said, no. I asked, then why are you staring? He replied, because you're louder when you're silent. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. He said, it does if you've been broken publicly. I stiffened. I didn't tell you anything. He nodded. You didn't need to. I said, are you enjoying this? He shook his head. Mockery bores me. I said, then pity. He said, I don't pity men who still stand. I laughed bitterly. You should look closer. He stepped nearer and said, I am. I said, who are you? He replied, Kale. I waited. And? He smiled faintly. That's enough for now. I said, you talk like you know me. He said, I know the look. I asked, what look? He said, the one that asks why loyalty feels like stupidity. My chest tightened. You should stop guessing. He said, you trusted someone who treated devotion like weakness. I snapped, stop. He paused. Does it hurt more when they laugh? I clenched my fists. You don't get to say that. He said, yet I just did. I said, what do you want from me? He said, nothing. I scoffed. That's a lie. He said, fine. I want to see if you stay small. I asked, and if I don't? He said, then you'll interest me. I felt exposed. You think I chose this? He said, no. I think you accepted it. I said, you don't know my life. He said, I know you replay conversations at night. I swallowed. Everyone does. He said, not everyone lets them define their worth. I said, you're enjoying this too. He said, correction. I'm assessing. I crossed my arms. Assessing what? He said, how much anger you're wasting on silence. I said, anger ruins people. He said, suppressed anger buries them. I looked away. I don't need a lecture. He said, you need a mirror. I laughed softly. I avoid those now. He said, because you don't recognize yourself. I said, you're very confident. He said, confidence comes from surviving humiliation. I looked back at him. So you've been there. He said, worse. I waited. And? He said, and I didn't let it rewrite me. I said, good for you. He said, it could be good for you. I shook my head. I'm not interested. He said, you already are. I said, don't flatter yourself. He said, you're angry because you were replaced. I said, I was betrayed. He corrected me. You were revealed. I said, revealed as what? He said, someone who gives too much without demanding respect. I felt my jaw tighten. Respect isn't demanded. He said, it's enforced. I said, that's not who I am. He said, it's who you've avoided becoming. I asked, why are you telling me this? He said, because you're standing at a choice. I said, what choice? He said, stay the punchline, or become the consequence. I laughed nervously. You talk like a villain. He said, villains are honest about power. I said, power ruined my relationship. He said, weakness did. I said, you're wrong. He said, then why does my voice feel familiar? I didn't answer. He said, you've been living below your potential. I said, you don't know my potential. He said, I know it scares you. I said, I'm tired of being analyzed. He nodded. That's fair. I turned to leave. He said, you won't stay invisible forever. I stopped. Is that a threat? He said, it's a promise. I asked, from you? He said, from yourself. I said, why should I trust you? He said, you shouldn't. Yet. I said, then why listen? He said, because something in you is already listening. I walked away, my heart pounding. I told myself, he's dangerous. Another voice whispered, he sees you. For the first time since everything shattered, I felt anger sharpen instead of rot, curiosity spark instead of fade, and hope ache instead of humiliate me. I lay awake staring at the ceiling and said, sleep already. Silence answered. I said, stop replaying it. My mind replied with her laugh. I whispered, I hate you. Then I corrected myself. No, I hate me. The next morning, I saw Cale again. He said, you look tired. I said, you stalking me now? He said, you're unraveling on schedule. I snapped, I don't need commentary. He said, you need structure. I laughed. Like revenge plans? He shook his head. Revenge is noisy. I said, noise feels good. He said, until it empties you. I said, she deserves pain. He said, she already lives shallow. I clenched my jaw. That's not enough. He said, it won't be. I asked, so what do you offer? He said, discipline. I scoffed. Sounds boring. He said, control always does. I said, I want her to regret it. He said, then become someone she can't touch. I said, that sounds like revenge. He said, it's self-respect. I stayed quiet. He said, you confuse peace with weakness. I replied, peace feels like losing. He said, that's because you equate pain with proof. I said, she broke me. He said, she exposed what you neglected. I snapped, you keep blaming me. He said, I keep giving you agency. I walked away angry. That night, I said to myself, he's wrong. Then I said, what if he's not? My phone rang. Lena said, you're avoiding me. I said, I'm busy. She said, busy being miserable. I sighed. What do you want? She said, honesty. I said, I'm fine. She said, say it without lying. I stayed silent. She said, you're hurting. I said, everyone hurts. She said, not like this. I said, she humiliated me. Lena said, and you're punishing yourself. I said, I should have seen it. She said, stop rewriting the past to hate yourself. I said, I feel small. She said, you're acting small. I said, because I am. She said, no, because you're afraid. I whispered, afraid of what? She said, of becoming bitter. I laughed softly. Too late. She said, no. You're standing at the edge. I said, I want her to hurt. She said, that won't heal you. I said, what will? She said, choosing yourself. I said, I don't know how. She said, start by admitting you're broken. I said, I am. She said, say it like you mean it. I swallowed. I'm not okay. She said, there. I felt something loosen. Later, alone, I said, staying weak is easier. Then I said, and that's why it's killing me. The next day, I found Cale. I said, I don't want revenge. He nodded. Good. I added, but I don't want peace that feels empty. He said, then build strength. I said, quietly. He smiled. Now you're listening. I said, I'm angry. He said, use it. I said, I'm ashamed. He said, outgrow it. I said, I still miss her. He said, that will pass. I asked, what if it doesn't? He said, then you'll be stronger anyway. I breathed out. No public fights. He said, no. I said, no posts. He said, never. I said, no proving myself. He said, exactly. I nodded slowly. I'll rebuild. He said, say it again. I said, I'll rebuild. He said, for who? I answered, me. That night, I slept for the first time. I didn't dream of her. I whispered into the dark, I choose becoming. Months passed without announcements, and I liked it that way. Kale said, you're late. I replied, I was working. He said, good. Discipline doesn't need excuses. I wiped sweat from my face and said, my body feels different. He said, because you stopped negotiating with pain. I said, I don't crave approval anymore. He said, that's growth. I trained harder, spoke less, listened more. Kale said, silence is your advantage. I asked, why does it feel powerful? He said, because it's earned. One afternoon, he said, you don't look down anymore. I said, there's nothing worth staring at. He smiled. Exactly. At college, whispers returned, but they changed tone. Someone said, he's different. Another said, he doesn't react. I told myself, let them talk. Dean Harper stopped me after class. He said, you've improved. I said, thank you, sir. He added, consistency like yours gets noticed. I nodded. I'll keep working. As I walked away, I felt steady. Marcus watched me from across the hall. He said, since when did you get so quiet? I replied, since noise stopped helping. He laughed nervously. Trying to act tough. I said, I'm not acting. He scoffed. Whatever. Kale later said, he senses the shift. I asked, does that matter? He said, only if you let it. I didn't. My nights were no longer haunted. I said to myself, rest is earned. Lena noticed too. She said, you're calmer. I said, I'm clearer. She asked, do you still hurt? I answered, sometimes. She said, but you're not bleeding. I smiled. Exactly. Era stood near the entrance one evening. She laughed loudly, like before. I didn't look. She said my name. I kept walking. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I said inside, you're a chapter, not the book. Kale said later, that was the test. I asked, did I pass? He said, you didn't engage. I said, I didn't need to. He nodded. Power grows when unused. Marcus tried again days later. He said, you think you're better now? I said, I think I'm better than before. He frowned. Same thing. I said, no. He stepped closer. You're different around her. I said, I don't see her. That rattled him. Dean Harper called my name in a meeting. He said, your leadership potential is showing. I said, I'm still learning. He replied, that's why you'll lead. I felt pride, quiet and controlled. Kale said, validation came to you. I said, I didn't chase it. He said, that's the point. My body felt stronger. My mind felt sharper. My emotions felt governed. I said to myself, this is mine. Era passed by once more. She said, you changed. I didn't stop. She said louder, I said you changed. I turned briefly and said, so did you. Then I left. Kale asked, satisfied? I answered, grounded. He said, that's better. I no longer replayed promises. I no longer questioned worth. I said, I stand now. The boy who froze felt distant. I trained. I learned. I waited. Not for revenge. For growth. For myself. Silence carried me forward, and power followed quietly behind me. I noticed the change before anyone said it out loud. Someone whispered, "Rohan's not around anymore." Another voice said, "He looks bored of her." I kept walking and told myself, not my story. Era laughed louder than usual in the hallway. I heard someone mutter, "She's trying too hard." I didn't turn. Later, Rohan passed me and said, "You look fine." I replied, "I am." He hesitated. "Things don't last forever." I said, "Some things never were." He walked away without another word. Kale said that evening, "You're witnessing consequence." I asked, "Is this karma?" He said, "It's gravity." Rumors shifted direction. I heard, "She's messy." I heard, "Guess the upgrade downgraded." I felt nothing. Era stood in my path one afternoon. She said, "Can we talk?" I said, "About what?" She said, "Us." I replied, "There is no us." She scoffed. "You don't have to be cold." I said, "I'm not cold. I'm done." She stepped closer. "You used to care." I said, "I used to bleed too." She frowned. "You think you're better now?" I said, "I think I'm finished." She said, "Say something. Yell at me." I shook my head. "That's what you want." She snapped, "You're enjoying this." I said, "I don't feel anything." That silence cracked her voice. She whispered, "Rohan doesn't look at me anymore." I replied, "That's not my problem." She said, "You don't even miss me?" I answered honestly, "No." Her eyes filled. "You're cruel." I said, "Cruel would be pretending." She walked away shaking. I exhaled and realized my hands were steady. Lena later asked, "Did you talk to her?" I said, "Briefly." She asked, "How do you feel?" I said, "Free." She smiled. "That scares her." I nodded. "Good." That's when Evelyn entered quietly. She sat beside me in the library and said, "Is this seat taken?" I said, "No." She smiled. "You always sit here." I said, "I like the quiet." She said, "Me too." We studied in silence. After a while, she said, "You think deeply." I said, "Too much sometimes." She replied, "Depth isn't a flaw." That stayed with me. Later, she said, "You don't perform for people." I asked, "Is that noticeable?" She said, "It's rare." I said, "I'm not looking for anything." She nodded. "Neither am I." That felt safe. Days passed. She asked, "Coffee?" I said, "Sure." She said, "No expectations." I smiled. Perfect. We talked about books, values, boundaries. She said, "Respect is quiet." I said, "So is trust." She looked at me and said, "You've been hurt." I didn't deny it. I survived it. She said, "I won't rush you." I said, "Thank you." Meanwhile, Era posted less. When she did, comments weren't kind. She said loudly once, "People switch up." I didn't react. Marcus whispered, "She's spiraling." I replied, "I'm not watching." Kale said, "You chose peace." I said, "I chose myself." Evelyn asked one night, "Why are you so controlled?" I answered, "Because I learned what chaos costs." She said, "I see strength, not walls." I felt seen. Era passed me again weeks later. She said softly, "I miss you." I replied, "I don't miss who I was with you." She flinched. I walked away without looking back. Evelyn later said, "You don't need to prove anything." I said, "I know." I realized then that karma didn't roar. It whispered. It didn't need my anger. It didn't need my revenge. I stood taller, calmer, untouched. The laughter that once haunted me faded. Not because I chased it away. Because I outgrew it. I didn't think you'd agree to meet, Era said. I didn't think I would either, I said. But say what you came to say. She took a breath. I'm sorry. I should have said that a long time ago. I watched her hands shake. For what exactly? For hurting you. For laughing. For choosing my pride. She swallowed. For leaving. I heard all of that before, I said. Just not from you. She nodded. I know. That's why it matters now. It matters to you, I said. That's different. She stepped closer. I replay our last fight every night. I don't, I said. That's the difference. Her voice cracked. I didn't know how much you needed me. I did, I said. And I learned how dangerous that was. She whispered, I regret it. I can hear that, I said. Your regret has a voice. It's just not in control anymore. She looked at me. I thought if I apologized, things could soften. They already did, I said. Just not the way you hoped. So there's nothing left, she asked. There's truth, I said. And truth doesn't always rebuild. She wiped her eyes. I miss you. I miss who I was before I broke, I said. Not the person who broke me. That's not fair, she said. I'm not trying to be fair, I said. I'm trying to be honest. She took another breath. I changed. I believe you, I said. I just didn't wait. She stared at the floor. I thought you'd still be there. I was, I said. Until I wasn't. Silence stretched between us, and I felt steady inside it. I didn't know you were this calm, she said. I wasn't, I said. I learned. She asked, is there any chance? There was, I said. It passed quietly. She looked up. Do you hate me? No, I said. I outgrew the version of me that needed you. Her lips parted. That hurts. I know, I said. That's why I'm not raising my voice. She whispered, so this is goodbye. This is closure, I said. Goodbyes still chase you. She nodded slowly. I mocked what you offered. You didn't know its value, I said. Neither did I. She exhaled. I lost you. You lost more than me, I said. You lost the person who would have stayed. Tears rolled down her face. I see that now. I know, I said. That's why this ends here. She waited. Can I say one last thing? You just did, I said. She gave a small, broken smile. I'm sorry. I heard you, I said. And I'm done carrying it. She turned away. She paused at the door. You're different. I had to be, I said. The old version kept begging. She turned back. I never asked you to beg. I know, I said. I volunteered. Her shoulders slumped. I didn't see your growth. I grew in silence, I said. It's easy to miss. She said, I thought strength meant leaving first. I thought love meant staying longer, I said. We were both wrong. She rubbed her arms. I wish I could go back. I don't, I said. Going back would erase who I became. She asked, did you ever stop loving me? I stopped abandoning myself, I said. Love adjusted. She frowned. That sounds cold. It's warm, I said. Just not desperate. She laughed softly. You always spoke like this. No, I said. I learned when words stopped working. She stepped closer again. I'm scared to leave. You were never scared before, I said. That should tell you something. She nodded. I see the cost now. Costs are clearer after payment, I said. She whispered, I wish I paid sooner. I wish I charged myself less, I said. Her eyes searched mine. So you're okay? I'm stable, I said. She smiled sadly. I used to think you'd never move on. She breathed out. Forward without me. Yes, I said. And it doesn't require blame. She said, I expected anger. I spent it already, I said. Interest rates were high. She almost laughed, then stopped. I deserve that. I'm not here to score points, I said. I'm here to end a chapter. She asked, will you remember me kindly? I'll remember accurately, I said. She winced. That's worse. It's cleaner, I said. She took a long look. You're not waiting for me to cry. I waited years, I said. I'm done waiting. She nodded again. Then this is mine to carry. It always was, I said. She opened the door. Take care of yourself. I do, I said. She hesitated. I hope someone sees you. They already do, I said. Including me. She left. I stood there, finally free. The crowd was already watching when Era spoke. So this is you now, she said loudly. Standing here like you mattered all along. I felt the heat of eyes on my back. You wanted an audience, I said. You've got one. She laughed. You always needed people to see you. I needed peace, I said. You confused the two. Someone murmured behind us. Era tilted her chin higher. Don't act calm. You hate this. I survived worse, I said. This is just noise. She stepped closer. You think you're better than me now? I think I'm done proving anything, I said. She turned to the crowd. He used to beg me to stay. I nodded. I did. Gasps followed. She smiled. Hear that? He admits it. I admit growth, I said. Not shame. Her smile tightened. You're still small. Before I answered, a voice cut through the space. That's enough. The crowd shifted. I didn't turn yet. Era scoffed. And who are you supposed to be? I'm Mr. Kale, he said. And he's here with me. Silence fell hard. Era blinked. With you? Mr. Kale stepped beside me. I oversee this project. Every decision runs through me. Whispers spread fast. Era laughed nervously. That doesn't mean anything. It means everything, Mr. Kale said calmly. Especially your behavior. Her face drained. You didn't tell me this. I don't announce my worth anymore, I said. The crowd leaned in. Mr. Kale added, mockery reflects poorly. Choose your next words carefully. Era opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I felt the silence wrap around us. Heavy. Loud. She looked at me. You planned this. No, I said. I outgrew your script. Someone behind us said my name with respect. Another nodded. Era whispered, say something. I already did, I said. Her hands trembled. You're enjoying this. I'm present, I said. There's a difference. Mr. Kale glanced at me. Shall we go? In a moment, I said. Era swallowed. You're letting them think you're important. I let them see truth, I said. She tried to laugh again. It broke. You were nothing without me. I was becoming something despite you, I said. The crowd shifted again. Phones lowered. Eyes softened. Era froze. Completely still. I spoke quietly. This is the moment you mocked before. Her eyes flicked around. They're staring. They're learning, I said. Mr. Kale said, we're done here. I nodded. Yes. Era finally found her voice. Wait. I looked at her. For what? For you to say something cruel, she said. I don't need to, I said. She whispered, you won. I stood, I said. Winning implies effort. Her breath shook. You're different. I didn't change today, I said. You just noticed. Someone clapped once. It stopped quickly. I didn't smile. Mr. Kale placed a hand on my shoulder. Ready. I faced the crowd. Thank you for listening. No applause. Just understanding. Era stared as we walked past her. She said my name. I didn't turn. The silence followed me. And it was enough. I said, I thought survival meant staying angry. Evelyn walked beside me. And now? Now it means staying honest, I said. She asked, does it still hurt? Yes, I said. But it doesn't lead anymore. She nodded. That's different. I used to think betrayal defined me, I said. Like it stamped my name. And now, she asked. It shaped me, I said. But it doesn't own me. We kept walking. Evelyn said, you're quieter lately. I finally hear myself, I said. She smiled. You don't need to prove anything. I know, I said. That's why it feels strange. She asked, do you miss the old you? I miss his hope, I said. Not his pain. She slowed. You never talk about her anymore. I don't need to, I said. Silence means it healed. Evelyn looked ahead. That's strength. It's acceptance, I said. Strength came later. My phone buzzed. I answered. My mother said, are you okay? I am, I said. She paused. You sound peaceful. I worked for it, I said. I didn't understand your silence before, she said. I thought you were lost. I was finding myself, I said. She sighed. I'm proud of you. I know, I said. That's enough. She asked, do you forgive them? I don't carry them, I said. That's better. We ended the call. Evelyn said, you didn't flinch. I stopped bracing, I said. She laughed softly. You're whole. I stopped chasing pieces, I said. We passed familiar streets. Evelyn asked, do you believe in karma? I believe in consequences, I said. Quiet ones. She said, you're not angry anymore. I spent it already, I said. It didn't pay interest. She took my hand. You chose peace. I chose rest, I said. She asked, what about bitterness? I don't need armor, I said. I'm not at war. She squeezed my hand. I like walking beside you. Not ahead, I said. Not behind. Together, she said. Yes, I said. I thought about nights I begged to be seen. I said, I survived myself. Evelyn looked at me. That's the hardest part. I learned pain doesn't disappear, I said. It waits for direction. And you redirected it, she said. I acknowledged it, I said. Then I released it. She asked, do you feel untouchable? I feel grounded, I said. That's stronger. We stopped at the corner. Evelyn said, this is where I turn. I know, I said. She smiled. You're walking forward. I don't look back anymore, I said. She asked, are you afraid? No, I said. I'm complete. She kissed my cheek. See you tomorrow. Yes, I said. I kept walking. I heard echoes of old accusations. They didn't reach me. I whispered, growth is louder. No one answered. I didn't need them to. I walked on, free.